Folks, good morning. I think we're going to kick us off here. And I just wanted to do a quick welcome. My name is Manuela Gil-Munoz, and I have the pleasure of working here at the University of St. Thomas in our Center for the Common Good. And our Center for the Common Good supports the task force that does all of our civic engagement efforts on campus. And this is one of those civic engagement efforts, really leaning into how do we have conversations across difference, how do we understand that our world is extremely polarized, and how do we kind of bridge some of those gaps. So we are very excited to be co-hosting this event this morning, and we're very grateful to our partners, Citizens League and Braver Angels, who are here to kind of engage us in this conversation. So thank you so much for being here on an early cold morning. But didn't it feel so good to have that little bit of a cold after a hot summer? That was great. Feel free to continue to have pastries and coffee. And then I think we're going to have a really good conversation. Just some housekeeping items. You see that there's 4 exits, so emergency exits kind of all around. And then the bathrooms are just kind of across this hallway a little bit to your left. So thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to Citizens League. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Manuela, and to the Center for Common Good and the University of St. Thomas. We really appreciate them hosting us this morning. And thank you all for joining us. We are, for those of you who are familiar with Citizens League, have been a supporter or follower of our work for a while. This event series, Mind Openers, is one that we have done for quite a while, but it was on a bit of a hiatus until this year. So we've brought it back. We're excited to be working with a lot of great organizations and partners. And very much kind of figuring out what works best. People like morning events. Do they like afternoon events? Do they like virtual things over the lunch hour? So you'll continue to see a mix of opportunities and conversations from us. If you're not familiar with Citizens League, we are about a 72-year-old nonpartisan nonprofit organization here in Minnesota. I like to sum it up as we're a civic engagement and public policy organization. So what that means is obviously this time of year, encouraging voter engagement and civic engagement is a big important role for us. But I like to think of civic engagement as broader than just turning up the vote and making sure that people show up in elections. It's also being educated on the issues and the topics that are impacting communities around our state. So we really try and do that through events just like this, convening important conversations and events to help us all learn a little and better understand topics of relevance and what's happening in our communities. What are people talking about? How can we all work together a little bit better to find solutions? We also do a lot of public policy research and projects. I'll tell you a couple of those that we're working on right now. And lastly, if you're not familiar, we run the Capital Pathways internship program. It will be soon starting its 10th year, so a major milestone. It's a very unique internship program specifically for BIPOC identifying college students to get direct experience with host organizations doing work in state government and at the local level in many cases. But really trying to help ensure that our state capital and the people working there and in roles in advocacy really reflect the broad base of communities that are present in Minnesota. So we are currently recruiting host organizations. If you work for an organization or you know one that may be interested in hosting an intern, we would love to hear from you, and you can find more information on our website at Capital Pathways Internship Program. We're really excited about today's conversation. Earlier this year, Citizens League was able to join with the University of St. Thomas, Braver Angels, in their Reduce the Ranker campaign, really trying to get our hands around this idea that our elections and our political system in general has gotten extremely polarized, extremely partisan, and we all have a role to play in toning down the tenor in the conversation and, as it's so called, reducing the rancor of political conversation. So events like this are one way that we're trying to do that. And really grateful to Bill and to Braver Angels and the whole team for leading that work and bringing a lot of organizations together. And that's sort of how we became aware of the Trustworthy Elections report. And I think this is a really timely conversation to understand how people across the political aisle are viewing ways that we can make sure that our election system continue to have integrity and that people can trust the results. So we're really looking forward to this. Just a few other reminders before we get started. I'll hand it over to Luna. If you haven't yet, please make sure you're registered to vote. mnvotes.org, the Secretary of State's resource. I have a hunch that most of you here already are, but we couldn't let it go by without making sure that we put that plug in. There are copies of the reports on your table or in the emails you received in advance. If you didn't get a chance to read the report in its entirety, we'll obviously be digging into it a little bit, but feel free to peruse that. We also will have some note cards out. I think Luna may have set a few out on your table. If you have questions throughout the discussion, just sort of we'll write them down, flag it for me. I'll be looking. We'll collect those and we'll have a little bit of time for audience Q&A at the end. And we are going to be using Mentimeter. I see many of you have already done it. There are QR codes on your table. You can just scan that or go to menti.com and enter that code in. We'll have a couple others that we'd love your participation on throughout the event. So with that, I think, Luna, I'm going to hand it over to you to take us away.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody.
Good morning. Testing. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning. My name is Luna. I serve as the policy director at the Citizens League. Prior to joining Citizens League, I was a Capital Pathways host organization supervisor and followed the work closely, but I led policy and advocacy work at YWCA Minneapolis in the Racial Justice and Public Policy Department. And before that, I worked for the U.S. Senate here in the district. So really excited for all of you to hear from our stellar panel today. I did want to give one moment to the cape. I think some of you are like, what is she wearing? And some of you are like, cool. I come from a family that is both very civically engaged and very creative. A lot of art and theater background in my lineage. And so my dad drove through town last month. He'd been seeing my grandma, who once ran the city arts department in New York in the city of Albany. And he had this, which a friend, Patty P., who was a costume professor at Skidmore, had gotten from her friend and mentor, Lloyd, for a show. And he said, I thought of you. And I said, I actually have more than one thing that I can wear that to. And this felt like the first. So a little note for the cape in the morning. Thanks, Patty and Lloyd and Pop. All right. Well, thank you again for joining us. If Mentimeter is not feeling user-friendly, that's okay. We're going to have a robust discussion regardless. But I'm going to start by having our panelists briefly introduce themselves. They can speak better of their work than I can. So panelists, if you could tell us a little bit about your work, your studies, and I think particularly right now when people might be feeling distrust at best and despair at worst, why is it important for us to have faith in our democratic systems? So Claire, over to you.
Oh, there you are. My think about it. Well, thanks. Okay. I'll do that. So I'm Claire. I'm a senior here at the University of St. Thomas. I'm studying sociology, justice and peace studies, and criminal justice. I work here at the University of St. Thomas in our Center for the Common Good with our voter education, civil engagement advocacy task force, otherwise known as CVIA. And I work to help mainstream civil engagement here, get everyone registered for voting, and just make it a really easy, knowledgeable, and make sure everyone has equal access to voting. And I think that it is really important to vote, to trust elections, as well as to use your agency in elections to really show your path, your vision, what you want in your community, in your government, and to make sure that you believe in what your community is standing for. Here. Up. Okay. Did I turn it off? It was never at 10. Okay. Ready back? No? You need to share. Let's share here. I'll trace you. Yeah. Okay. Now can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. My name is Halla Henderson. I am the Deputy Executive Director with Minnesota Voice as well. As well as I serve as the chair of the St. Paul School Board. So elections are super important to me. Not just because oftentimes people I know or myself have been on the ballot, but because they allow us to share the things that matter in our community, right? And how we move them to the forefront, and how we say whether or not we are meeting the expectations of what we need for it as a community. I think my path here has been interesting in that I grew up in a community which was often underrepresented. So I grew up in North Minneapolis, and it was really apparent to me from a young age that there were aspects of my community's experience that were unseen, both consciously and unconsciously. And the impact, right, was that I grew up seeing the difference between my community and other communities and wanting to understand why. I ended up here at the University of St. Thomas, where I really had the first opportunity to actively engage in what it looks like to be a participant in democracy and to think about how that participation in democracy then can shape policy. And that, I think, led me down the path of wanting to work with students, and then ultimately in this space where we are able to, at Minnesota Voice, to mobilize and to support BIPOC communities, as well as organizations that serve predominantly underrepresented voices or BIPOC communities across the state. And to say, right, that not only does your voice matter, but here, let's get you out there to vote. And then let's also think about how we center your voice in this process. And I think that's been a really important angle for me as a person, but then also as an organization. I often talk about, and I shared with Claire a little bit ago, when you think of the people who are often targeted in political conversations, it's a very specific person. It's the people that vote, right? You want to first turn out the folks who vote, and then it's everyone else. We focus on everyone else. And that's our bread and butter. That's our space. And that's what I think we do pretty well.
Okay, I'll try this one. I'll break with the pattern of struggling with the microphone first. But I know you are asking me where I got this great gray blazer.
Yes.
And I thought I would just tell you later.
We want the story.
Where.
We want the story.
No, I'm not going to be stood up. I'm one up on that one. So this is my best gray blazer. So Bill Doherty, I'm a professor emeritus, recently retired from the University of Minnesota, where I taught the family therapy for a number of decades. I'm a co-founder of Braver Angels, which presumably you know about because you're here, but it's a civic organization, national with a local chapter here, where we try to bridge the partisan divide and help our democratic republic survive the polarization that we're in. And I'm here because of this report that took us a couple of years to work on. And I think if we don't figure out how to have a consensus about our elections, we're in serious trouble.
We're going to stick with you, Bill, as we move forward. So we have this question here. On a scale of 1 to 10, what's your sense of how strongly Americans trust our elections in the room? 7 seems to be winning. I thought we would have no 10s, but we have 1, 2. So I'm curious your reaction to this, maybe in comparison to the work you did over several years with the report. And then also just, if you could ground us a little bit in the Trustworthy Elections report. What was the process? How did it come to be?
Well, it's a very optimistic group here. So that's good. Maybe it's the coffee. I don't know. But we decided to tackle this core issue of trustworthy elections. And by the way, it took a long time to come up with the name because everybody owns their own name for what the problem is. So trustworthy is what we came up with because neither side had owned that yet. And as you know, we have a lot of Americans who believe that there is fraud, that elections cannot be trusted. And then there are a lot of Americans who believe the principal problem is lack of access. So an area they're trying to still meet and back and forth and back. And then everybody has their leaders who just talk about one of those two worries. So one of our leaders, Rena Bernards and others, decided to tackle this in a systematic way over a couple-year period where we brought together 26 groups from around the country, regular people. There were about 8 what we call red-leaning, more conservative-leaning people whose main concern is the lack of integrity of the elections, fraud and mistakes that ought not to be there. And then 8 blue-leaning Americans whose main concern is the lack of access of people and the suppression of votes, which is what you're talking about. And so this process of bringing people together in common ground workshops. I'll just briefly describe it. It's a 5-hour in-person experience, although it can be done online. And people have a chance to talk about what got them interested in. These are all people who felt strongly about this issue. And so we begin with stories. Tell us what led you, what in your background, what in your life has led you to be passionate about this issue. And then what's the core of this? What's mostly at stake for you? So people get a chance to talk about their values, their concerns, connected to their personal story in some way. And there's a series of listening sessions, one-to-one and in groups, where the first part of the workshop, you're listening to people who disagree with you, and you're not arguing back. You're just trying to get them, their story, their values, their concerns, and how they think we should move forward. And then the next part of the workshop, the reds and blues go to separate spaces, and having listened to the other side, they come up with values, concerns, and policy solutions, 3 columns, that they believe we need, and that they think the other side could accept. So you see, it's an exercise of role taking. Having listened, what do I believe we need that they might accept? And so then they come together, and each group shares values, concerns, and policy solutions that they want to put on the table for potential common ground. There's clarification of those. And then everybody, both groups do that, and everybody votes on each of those about whether they can accept them. And it has to be unanimous. It has to be unanimous. Sometimes there are a few things that are close to being unanimous, and then they'll go back into red-blue groups to see if they could fix the wording, change it in some way, bring it back to the group. And at the end of it, they come out with consensus, values, concerns, and policy solutions. And every group come up with a bunch of them. We've done this process, by the way, with issues that people think there's no common ground, like abortion. That was the first one we did. Okay, and so then there was a national task force who then pulled together from all of these groups. There were 727 values, concerns, and solutions. And then a group, again, half red, half blue, that came together to hammer out a final consensus on the policy solutions. And I had the opportunity to facilitate that workshop. That was my main involvement in the process. And so what I want to tell you is that having participated that last day, trust gets built when people take each other's concerns seriously. Because what happens is people who think that there's a problem of fraud think that the other side who talk about suppression are just kind of making that up. Like if you want to vote, you can vote. What's the big deal? So they think that the concerns are not really genuine. Similarly, those whose concerns are about suppression think that people on the other side, they don't really think there's a lot of fraud. They don't really think that. It's a talking point. It's a way to win them because they're ignoring the facts. They're ignoring the data, and they're doing it for their own political ends. Can you see how we can't find common ground if we don't trust our motives? If I don't think you're serious about this. So what happens in those conversations, people get to see that they're serious. And that was my experience with the leadership group at the end. Very smart people. There were 20 people, very smart people, with serious concerns who learned to take those concerns seriously. And so just a couple of highlights from what came out of it. 3 principles agreed on by the whole group. Voting should be easy. Cheating should be hard. Every citizen should have an equal say in who will govern them. This is done through free and fair elections, and the American government will fail if candidates refuse to accept any outcome other than victory. Those are the 3 guiding principles, and just a couple of the 23 specific solutions that were grouped into various topics. And I'm going to highlight a few that made each side have to breathe to accept. Because if you're not going to compromise, if you're not going to try to find some common ground, if each side's going to hold on to what they're most concerned about. So the access, the Reds agreed that that federal election day should be a national holiday. So it's no small concession because most were free market, minimal government intrusion conservatives. Okay. And that all states should implement a no excuse needed absentee ballot process. So on the blue side, big issue is voter ID. And voter ID is huge to people who are concerned about trustworthy elections. It's huge to Reds. Such that just as if you don't open up more access, the blues are going to walk away from the table. If you don't address the voter ID thing, the Reds are going to walk away from the table. And so what they come up with is that states should require a person to show voter ID when voting. It should be the affirmative duty of state governments to provide an acceptable free voter ID, either photo or non-photo, so it doesn't have to be photo, to every eligible voter. And that government-provided voter ID should be one, but not the only acceptable ID. And then there's stuff about photo versus not. So that was a hold on to yourself concession by the blue side. And there's lots of others, some of which were controversial. Now, I want to highlight this one, is that there was a unanimous agreement that the way we resolve disagreements about elections is through the courts, and that everyone must commit to agreeing with the final decision of the courts. So that was a really big one. Well, there's no controversy about. So where we've gone with this is a campaign getting us into the hands of state secretaries of state. Steve Simon has read it, really likes it. He's the chair of the National Association of Secretaries of State. It's being talked about there. There are various groups working at the level of state legislatures to try to get some of this in. And so it's been quite a fascinating process. And I'll just say, we learned a lot from this, and we're going to do it again with immigration in the next couple of years. And one of the things we learned, we didn't know this time that we do next time. We have some major red and blue national organizations been working on this. The downside of what we did here is it was just our thing. We developed it. We didn't have a great idea about what to do next. We're trying to get stuff done with it, but we learned that we need to have major stakeholders involved right at the beginning, so that when we come out with this, it's ready to make a splash. So I'm happy to be here to talk about it.
Thank you so much. For the robust grounding. You all have copies of the reports at your tables, or you can grab them from other tables. There's just one at each table, but it is online, and you should have received it in your email. So please continue to engage with Braver Angels in forums like that by visiting their website. I think I'm going to pivot a little bit because we're talking about the report. So Claire and Halla, based on your work, I'd love to hear reactions you have to some of the recommendations in the report. If there's any you disagree with, what you think is the most important based on specific constituencies that you work with. Anyone can start.
So when I was reading the report, I didn't necessarily disagree with anything that was in the report. I think it was very well-versed, very grasping what a lot of concerns with elections are facing today. I think one thing that is important to highlight is that a lot of people feel distrust in elections today, which is something that not only in Minnesota, but globally, we're really trying to emphasize that there is no mistrust in elections. The Secretary of State did a whole report, found, I think in 2018, that we had maybe 3 votes that were fraudulent votes out of 1 million. And so it is not a common thing to have a fraudulent voting. I think it's something that is constantly seen in social media for people my age, is that we cannot trust elections. I think it's important to emphasize that, especially here in Minnesota, we do everything we can to make our elections clear, concise, trustworthy, as well as eligible. So people that cannot vote do not even have the chance to vote.
Yeah, I would echo some of what you just said, right? That I think reading the report, a lot of it was like, yeah, this makes sense to me. This feels right. And I would also say the for the average voter, right, in Minnesota, so folks who can vote, there is a fairly decent trust in at least our Office of the Secretary of State, right? So OSS, it's pretty well trusted. I think you hear pretty frequently, we believe in fair and equitable elections. That message typically carries. Oftentimes, Minnesota is looked to other states as an example of how we can both create systems that are well-designed and thoughtful in how we bring folks into the process, but then also how we respond when things do happen. There's a reason that we have such good voter outcomes in Minnesota. And on the other hand, I think the thing that was interesting to me as I was reading and as I was reflecting is that, and I think you named it as well, is it's difficult, right, if you are coming at a level 10 of fear and distrust, whether that's I feel like I will be persecuted if I walk into this polling place, and or I do not believe that this polling place is doing the things that it needs to do to safely and carefully count every single vote that is eligible to be there. Then we are moving through, you can't move through that space with facts. It's just, we're not going to be able to show up and say, actually, Secretary Simon said X, Y, Z, instead, because people are moving through in a fear of emotion. So there has to be, and I think this is what we show up to do with our own communities, we have to have message carriers who make sense and are relevant for the individual communities that we're talking to. Oftentimes what we're dealing with at Minnesota Voice is not, I don't believe that elections are fair. It's, I am afraid that if I show up, someone might yell at me. Someone might question whether or not I am legal and able to vote. Right now, we're working on turning, so in 2022, there was a law change that allowed formerly incarcerated folks who were convicted of a felony to regain the right to vote. We're working on getting those folks registered, sharing and combating misinformation that they cannot vote, and then helping them to get to the polling places. And at the same time, there's an education piece and to move past this now, oftentimes decades of fear of if I vote, something bad will happen to me. That is not technically a factual response, but that is an emotional response. And so our job is to think about, okay, who's the right person to stand on your doorstep and tell you, you have the right to vote now. You have the right to vote and you should exercise it. It's not me, someone who's never experienced that, but it is someone who either comes from a similar background or community and or someone who is able to walk through those steps and is a trusted message carrier.
Thank you. You answered the question I was going to sort of follow up with, which is what are strategies we can use, particularly with communities who have been historically disenfranchised from the vote, to continue to build trust or, do better. One thing that I think is interesting that's coming up no matter what is the importance of narrative and sitting together and talking about why we hold values we have and giving some story to that. And there's less space for that and it's uncomfy. So I think that's an important takeaway for us today. Our ED and I got to take part in a Braver Angels workshop recently. And that was one of my takeaways, is thinking about, can I sit with someone who disagrees with me, hear a story, hear a value, hear a concern, and at least say, yes, you hold those things and those are your truth, whether I disagree with the content or not. And it's a helpful and humanizing reminder in a really tough time. So thank you for expanding. I welcome more expansion on that. Claire, I want to ask you a little bit about your work specifically on campus with Sevilla, with the Center for the Common Good. Are there patterns that you see in terms of questions you get from students, challenges students and young voters are facing, and maybe what of the report feels like something that's important for younger voters, university voters?
Yeah, so here at Sevilla, we really try to do a ton of events around voting, whether it's with Braver Angels now for about a year, but we also try to just be in the community as much as we can, because students have a lot of questions about how to vote, where do I vote, how do I register? And I think some of the most common questions we get are students from either greater Minnesota areas or outstate are just confused about, can I register here? Am I allowed to vote? Will I get in trouble if I re-register here?
Is it, do I have to pay to register even? Things that to some people might be common knowledge, but to a lot of students, and especially a lot of students that are coming from all different paths of lives, just don't know. And so we're really trying to strive to just make everything equal and accessible. So all students at St. Thomas can understand that, yes, you can vote here. If you live on St. Thomas, you can actually vote right in here on election day. And there's so many other resources we provide, such as we have a lot of international students that are just curious about what our election system looks like. What can we do as international students to get involved in elections, even if we can't vote? So we really try to bridge gaps, as well as really implement nonpartisan, equal, and unbiased information about candidates. We try to hold resources so everyone can have the education that they need, not feel like they're being targeted by any side, and be able to develop their own self-identity, which is so important for college students, especially when you're first entering into the voting scene. Especially this year, we have had a lot of students come up to us and we have some resources where we show what will be on your polling ballot, how it isn't just a presidential election, how there are other things. And they have questions about, can I bring in, a little fact sheet? Am I allowed to use my phone? Stuff like that. That, again, is typically, to some people might be common knowledge, but to a lot of students, it's really scary to vote. It can seem really intense. And so we really make it so that everyone understands that you as a citizen, as a right, this is your chance to show your voice. This is your chance to show advocacy and agency. And it's just really important to really get St. Thomas students out voting.
Thank you. And thanks for your work registering and educating student voters. I was in a voter education training recently, and just want to underscore what Halla said in terms of how lucky we are to have a super robust Office of Secretary of State. When I've tried to direct other people that I know in other states to the Secretary of State's office, I'm like, that's where you can get your sample ballot and see all these things and look at all the statute, and then I'm wrong. And I go there, I'm like, what's even on here? So that's a resource that I really trust. Bill, I want to pivot back to you. I'm wondering, this was not in what I sent earlier, but dun, dun, dun. It's about the blazer. I'm just kidding. Could you briefly tell the story of kind of the inception of Braver Angels and how you got involved? But more specifically, anything that has surprised or heartened you about agreement across partisan ideologies in either the work of this report or the work you've done with Braver Angels in the last 14 years? Seven.
Yeah.
Oops. Not enough coffee for the moderator.
That's right. Give you my blazer. That's the power of blazer. So briefly, the origin story, Braver Angels, about a week after the 2016 presidential election. Everybody remember that election? I was sitting in my home office in Roseville, and got a call from a colleague of mine, David Blankenhorn, who he and I worked on family issues for many years. And he said he had been on the phone with another colleague of ours, David Lapp from Southwest Ohio, and they were talking about how people were feeling about the election in the Upper East Side of Manhattan versus South Lebanon, Ohio. And the world was ending in Manhattan, and it was morning in America in Southwest Ohio. And they decided impulsively, in the spur of the moment, to get 10 Hillary Clinton voters and 10 Donald Trump voters together for 13 hours over a weekend in early December in Southwest Ohio to see if they could talk with each other, not just about each other. I'm looking at some folks over there who had the same reaction I did, a combination of laughter and you got to be kidding me. And so I said, wow, it's pretty brave. What were you thinking of doing with them? And then they said they didn't know, but they thought maybe I could figure that part out. And I honestly was hoping I was not free. Like, I would have loved. I would have been right on that. Okay, but I was free. And honestly, several years later, I think of this as I felt like my country was calling me. I have a skill set about bringing people together, groups together, and about how to design activities. And there was the moment. And so I said yes, and then figured out everything I knew, talked to everybody who had ever mentored me in group dynamics. And so we had that experience Friday night, all day Saturday, Sunday morning, and it was very powerful. It was very powerful. And I won't tell the whole, well, just a little bit more. I thought it would be one-off. I thought it would be, ask me what I did after that election. And the story, of course, would get bigger and bigger as the years went on. And then pour me another Chardonnay, and I'll tell you more, okay? But the group didn't want to stop. We cashed in another frequent flyer ticket, went back for reunion, and we decided to keep going. So that's how Brave Angels got started. No big strategic plan. We had this experience and we moved forward. The biggest learning, I think, is that if you get people to access their values, hopes, and aspirations for themselves, their children, all of our children, and our country, if you can get to that, we have a lot in common. Big thing I learned specifically was to not confuse policy differences with ultimate value differences. Policies are means to ends. And somebody and I could differ drastically in policy. I ought not to make the assumption that they're ill-motivated and that they occupy a different moral universe than I do, with my being the moral side. Thank you. So that just those are a couple of thoughts. Thank you.
Test. Thank you very much. A quick reminder, if you want to write a question down on a note card, this would be the time. We have additional questions on Mentimeter, so no pressure. But if you have questions, Jake will do a loop in a few minutes. I wanted to ask Halla, as someone who has run for office in recent years, in your experience as a candidate, how do you find that conversations about voting go, in a nonpartisan fashion? When people are thinking hyper-local, do you feel like that changes some of the trust, mistrust? Any reflections on kind of the candidate education side of that?
Yeah. Denial? Yeah, no. Okay. I think, well, I will say one, when you're running for the school board, no one is asking you if they can trust the election and the election results. Instead, what you're trying to do is to get people to vote. The lower down on the ballot that you get, the drop-off rate is dramatic. So it's also, right, the more local you get, sometimes the impacts are the closest. We are talking about taxpayers and the way that we use those tax dollars. We're talking about the health and wellness and knowledge of our students and the future folks who work in our schools and work in our hospitals, who are cooking in our restaurants, right? Like those are the folks who we're going to experience and move through for decades to come. So I think the other like difficulty for me as both someone who's running for office and like someone who works in voting spaces, and I think like my bread and butter is often like I want to reach as many new folks as possible. You can't often do that as when you're running a campaign. You have to go to the folks who vote. That's especially if you're new, if your name has never been on a ballot before, you're running in a race that is low on the ballot, not often voted in. I have to start with people who show up every year for an election. But what that means, right, is that you're kind of like, it's kind of the snake that's eating its own tail. You end up then with the same voting pool year over year over year. And what I noticed, right, is that it was really two types of folks. It was people who deeply cared about the city, and if I can be honest, like city politics. And it was people who had a direct stake in our schools, but it didn't often mean that it was the parents in our schools. It was like very active parents or people that knew all of the tools and things that they needed to do to vote and why they should vote and why school boards matter. But it wasn't necessarily a parent who sends all of their kids through SPPS, has either like a lot of praise or a lot of complaints, and moved a lot. Like that person would have never been on my list of doors to knock. I don't know that I would have been able to feasibly find that person. But those voices are also really deeply important. So when you show up representing a city of over 200,000 and you get maybe a fraction of those votes, there's work then that you need to do to make sure that you're reaching them. I will be honest, I don't know that we do that well right now. I don't know that any school board does it super well. And I would say, if I broaden that a little bit, our elected officials in general have always struggled with who to get to turn and what you do post-election.
I appreciate that in particular as we think about some of the solutions outlined in the report. Bill talked about policy and how our values are not the same as our policies, right? How we do what we do. So I'm thinking about if candidates are really wanting to engage new voter pools, but have to rely on existing voter pools for sheer numbers, what's missing in how we do what we do that means that doesn't maybe need to be where the focus is, either in the interim time of education. There's solutions in here about civics education in high schools, things that all voters should know about, how we get to that space, registration rates, so that some of that becomes more coalesced in terms of goals. All right, let's do some audience Q&A.
And if there's any more, last call. I got one more here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Beautiful. 9:17. I'll read the question, and if one of you feels called, hop in and popcorn it. What impact do you see social media as having on election distrust, and how do you recommend one navigate the space as someone who isn't committed to fully unplugging from it? I appreciate this question. So don't want to fully unplug from social media, how to navigate when it is something being used for a lot of mistrust.
Sorry. Social media is obviously very big in younger spaces. I'm on social media all the time, as well as most people my age. But I think we are really put into echo chambers of what politics we follow, being forced policies on us, being kind of, always put into the same space. And so I think it's really important to not only keep that knowledge with you when you're using social media, that you are part of an echo chamber, that something is being biased and persuaded towards you, but understand that you can use social media to help yourself. I think social media has been a great way to improve and enhance how democracy engages with students. And it's really shown you can use organizations such as Braver Angels, Vote Minnesota, that are super nonpartisan, really just want to give you information. It's hard to get those sources out to students, but I think it's such a great way to show that not all social media is going to keep you in that echo chamber. You do have to seek it out, but it is something that can be done. It's something that is increased over the years, especially with the rise of new social medias, as well as the rise of advocacy.
Thank you. Others on this one? All right.
That was a great answer.
Bill, I think this one's for you. How can we get the wisdom and goodwill from Braver Angels to expand to the base of supporters in liberal and conservative communities? You spoke a little bit about how for upcoming campaigns, you're going to have additional organizations at the front, but other thoughts?
Well, our theory of change is that you will not we will not directly access people who are the most highly polarized. We're going to access people who are in the middle and either side, but not the extremes. But the people that we access are in contact with others. Okay. So we have a workshop called Depolarizing Within. And that is, how do we engage with people of like mind when the conversation veers into demonizing and stereotyping, millions of people? And so how do you speak up in your own community without getting yourself fired from your own community? So we don't worry about people. Some people just reject what we're doing out of hand. That's okay.
Sure.
But they are in contact with others.
Another Braver Angels specific question. This might be a talk after, but how does Braver Angels address actual value differences, things like freedom versus equality in sessions?
The assumption is that there are big differences between each side. That's to be worked out in the conversation.
Yeah.
In the workshop that you attended the other day, one of the things it's called Skills for Disagreeing Better. We lay out conservative values and concerns and liberal values and concerns. as people on each side would articulate them. All of our leaders, by the way, leadership is half red, half blue. So everything we do has been vetted by both sides. And one of the effects of that exercise is that people on each side see more common ground than they would have imagined. So we don't start off as if there is a chasm and how in the world are we going to bridge it? But how does it play out? And because almost everybody believes in this country in freedom and equality, it's how do you actually implement it? And then what's the balance? What are the trade-offs? And each side has different trade-offs. And like with the election, different or anyway, I'll stop there. And so we don't assume a chasm. We assume that there's going to be differences with some commonality.
Yeah.
Thank you. This one I'm going to give to you, Halla. It says, to the point of trusted messengers, what can a middle-class white person do to help get out the vote?
Well, I think you're making an assumption that there are white folks that don't vote, or that the only white folks vote, right? And that there are plenty of white folks in our own communities right here who do not vote. There are plenty of white folks in rural Minnesota who are both actively suppressed from voting because of a lack of polling places, because of a lack of information, because of feeling like their votes don't matter, no matter where you are in the political aisle. So I think that, one, I am a firm believer, let's start with our own communities and then move forward. But then also, I mentioned our Restore the Vote work. That list is predominantly older white men. I talked a little bit about how do we make sure that the right folks are in the right spaces? Well, we thought about trusted message carriers in a couple of different ways. Who are the folks who are predominantly impacted on this list? Yes, it's white men, but it's also people of color at a disproportional rate. So who are the folks that we need there? It's lawyers who are trusted. It's the ACLU. It's community members who already have organized in spaces with these folks before. It's people who have shown up to court dates and been a part of this process. So I don't think it's you only need to organize your own, but it's to how you be thoughtful around it. And there's a lot of work to be done in our own communities. There are plenty of folks that we can mobilize, and how you could show up to be an ally in that work as well.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move us through some Menti questions for a minute because it's fun to see things pop up in real time. Panelists, you're welcome to do it too. We have our QR code here on your phone. You scan the code or you go to menti.com and the code is 2831566. Here are the 7 election topics in the report. Rank them in order of importance to you. Maybe you can do top 3. You don't have to do all 7. You should be able to just zip them around. Fair and equal access to voting. Verifiable voter identity and eligibility. Transparency and accountability. Redistricting, gerrymandering. Confidence in vote counting. Safety and security in the elections process. And peaceful transfer of power. Just interesting to see these come through.
Yeah. Listen. Still. Thanks. Later that. Right. Wow. You. Yeah. I need.
I'm trying to do it and it's challenging. If you're having trouble, you're not alone. Okay. We'll be here another 30 seconds or so. I know we're going to go fast, but. What sources do you trust for election information? You should be able to type in sources. They'll pop up here. We'll see if they grow. That means more than one person has typed them in. Secretary of State, Vote 411 is through the League of Women Voters, Citizens League. Thank you.
Right.
Jake Loesch.
A lot of pressure.
All right. Public radio, NPR, New York Times, local nonprofits, traditional media, election workers. Jake from the Citizens League.
Jake, you should have Jake, only put your name in once, okay? People I have to pay money in.
Sevilla's on here. I don't know if I said that right, but love. Variety of sources, many of them Jake from the Citizens League. And have you registered to vote? Yes, no, don't know. Interestingly, someone said earlier, this might be a room of people who definitely are registered. Today, October 15th, is the last day you can pre-register online in Minnesota. You can still register same day if you forget or if something happens or if you move.
What a shock.
But it's looking like yes. I just want to give a plug for our election judges and for checking your registration always. My husband and I bought a house this summer. We moved. We were all set for the primary election. We're like, we're set. We were not, in fact, set. We had all of our documents. None of them was on the approved list. You cannot actually use your mortgage. It has to be certain types of bills. And so we were at the polling place for like an hour, but the election judges were amazing. There was an issue with the computer. They called headquarters. Thank goodness for them. But check your registration. Do it today. Even if you don't, you can register same day in Minnesota. And finally, do you prefer to vote early in person, absentee, at the polls on election day? Some of you might be wearing either I will vote or I have voted stickers. Nice.
Before we finish, I want to make a comment.
Please. Want to do it now?
Yeah.
I'll have a final question.
So when I looked at the concerns, I made this wild guess that this is more of a blue room than a red room in terms of concerns. And so I want to put in a urging, like voter ID was at the bottom. Here's one of the things I learned in this process, that for many conservatives, there's a multi-generational belief that in our big cities, a Republican has to get 55% of the votes in order to win, because there is skimming of votes. That is not crazy. I grew up in Philadelphia. Okay, it's not, and there has been widespread in the past a voter fraud. This is not a. Let me sit down today and look at the factual information. This is passed down. There's a lineage here, okay, of concern and fear. So then you come to a place like with the 2020 election, where there's lots of rules changing because of COVID. And then you have political leaders who say this is all fraud. So you don't have people just coming for the first time to this concern. I had a Black colleague and friend who, with Hurricane Katrina, was convinced that the Army Corps of Engineers breached the levee in the 9th Ward in order to flood and wipe out the 9th Ward, largely Black ward, so that it could be redeveloped by rich people. There's a lot of, I don't think that happened. I don't know what she thinks now. But there is a legacy of concerns when there's big things going on of what's going to happen to Black folks. She carried that to this. Okay. So I'm offering that as part of the journey that I have gone through, to have empathic concern, empathy for people of goodwill who are smart, who have a lot of backgrounds of worry. And then if you have leaders who activate that and nobody takes them seriously, that you're a bunch of bigots or whatever, that's when we get the polarization.
Sure. I appreciate the check on that. And the reminder again that if we are sitting with one another, we need the space to know, yeah, I'm hearing your concern as your concern and not thinking already that you think I'm not going to hear your concern. But I think often we need a facilitator for that. That's braver angels. I think what I'll do is give a few notes and then end with our final question so that the panelists have the last word. I want to give a big thank you to all of you for joining us early on a Tuesday morning, just a few weeks out from election. We really appreciate all of you. Please feel free to stay engaged with the Citizens League. If you like this, if you like other work that we do, we have a pretty broad slate of events coming up through the end of the fall and into the new year. You're welcome to use the QR code over there to make a donation. You can become an organizational member, which supports our work in a broader basis and allows you to host things like this. You can host a Capital Pathways intern during the legislative session at your organization if your team would benefit from that capacity. Capital Pathways is entering its 10th year. Visit our website to see more about the policy projects that we are doing, upcoming events, our work. If you have a question or an idea, you can email policy@citizensleague.org. Please register to vote. I think it looks like we're covered in that area. I just want to make sure I covered all my bases. Okay, panelists. To close, during this highly polarized election season, what gives you hope? Can be a word, can be an anecdote. We'll end on a hopeful note.
So I will start by saying that I always own that I am a pessimist. I think it's important to say I like to come from a place of let's think about all of the worst possible outcomes and then be pleasantly surprised when they don't come to fruition. But I'll share. I was doing it. It keeps coming up for me because it feels like the most impactful work that I've done in a long time. I was doing phone banking for our voter restoration work, and had quite a few calls with folks who already knew about it, which is always a really, really good sign. But then also folks who very clearly didn't want to talk to, and that was okay too. And then I had a gentleman I picked up. And I will own that I made an assumption about how this conversation was going to go based on the place that I could see as his address and the information that I could put from his name. And I shared who I was. And I shared what I was calling about. And he paused. And then he said, say it again. And I told him again that his right to vote had been restored. And he said, say it again. And I said it for a third time. And he went, I didn't know. I had no idea. I thought this would never happen. And it was the most powerful conversation I had with someone. I don't know how that man is going to vote. I don't care how that man is going to vote, but I know that he can vote. And he knows that he can vote. And that's why I'm doing the work. Yes, there are policies and there are values and there are things that I believe in. But I also fundamentally believe that if you have the right, you should use it.
Yeah, that's correct.
Can you get that? I think also going off that kind of same notion, we have so many new Gen Z voters this year that are voting for their first time. And I think that just brings me hope that so many people will go out to their elections and vote who they truly believe in. And I also just want to emphasize you have the right to vote. It's your voice, it's your agency, and it's such an amazing way to use your voice and agency. So that gives me a lot of hope for this election.
And before I give my final word, I'd like to thank the Citizens League for sponsoring this, for University of St. Thomas for hosting. Also here, we have other partners, Minnesota Public Radio, League of Cities. So really, Brand Branch is very grateful for the support and the partnership. On my signature line of my Gmail, I have the phrase, keep hope alive. And so every time I look at email, I think of that. And then yesterday I heard a line I'm going to keep in mind, and that is hope is a muscle. It's not a feeling.
And I have been thinking a lot about a quote from Mariam Kaba, which is hope is a discipline. So we will keep flexing that muscle. Bill, Claire, and Halla, thank you so much for the work that you do and for your conversation this morning. And thank you again to all of you for joining us. Happy civic engagement.
Thank you.